Lisa Cartwright is an artist and educator. She's a professor at the University at UC San Diego, where she's appointed in the department, I think now you said of fine art.
Communication, Science Studies, Critical Gender Studies, and Visual Arts.
And visual arts. So we'll drop that. Lisa works across film, media and visual studies, gender and sexuality studies, science, technology, information and medicine studies, and disability studies. She's the author of Moral Spectatorship, Technologies of Voice and Affect in Post-War Representations of the Child, Screening the Body, Tracing Medicine's Visual Culture, and co-author of Practices Looking, an Introduction to Visual Culture. This being a key text for many young art students early in their academic careers. As you might imagine from this, Professor Cartwright's work lends itself to numerous different entry points, offering meaningful insight to academics working in a large variety of disciplines. Coming from the perspective of media, art, and photography studies, I encountered Professor Cartwright's work for the first time at the Feeling Photography Conference here in the fall of 2009, organized by Matt Brower, one of her past students. While the affective and apparatus-born claims of her work were familiar to me, I was fascinated by her focus on the material role of medical imaging within broader visual cultural studies. Much of Dr. Cartwright's work aims to transcend traditional distinction drawn between medicine and visual culture, in an effort to trace the intersubjective and affective relationship that arises between bodies, largely medicalized bodies, and between bodies and imaging technologies. While there's been a recent and growing demand for the return of materially tethered criticism within the humanities and social sciences, matter and materiality have always laid at the heart of Dr. Cartwright's work. Shedding at least some of the indexical baggage of photographic technologies, Dr. Cartwright has repeatedly demonstrated to us how the seemingly representational, the filmic, the textual, recently the animated, is always already material, if only as a result of its embodied articulation. The recurring appearance of the hand within her work, or perhaps better explained as her exposure to hidden handiwork of medical imaging, stands as a testament to this. Like I said, I can't help but read this as an implicit critique of Rosalind Krauss's When Words Fail, a text that actually I read for the first time in Matt's class, and I was excited to see Rosalind Krauss's name appear in her abstract for today's talk. Dr. Cartwright's work is a pleasure to read. The subtle and nuanced theoretical depth of her writing is only rivaled by its concise accessibility of her language. It is precisely this tendency towards maintaining complexity while aspiring to clarity that I believe makes Practices of Looking such a fantastic and impressive introductory text to the theoretical and actual parameters of visual culture. That's my introduction. I'm looking forward to the talk. Thanks so much for coming.
I love coming to Toronto because it's one of the places where you get just like the smartest introductions, and it just goes beyond, did this person find something nice to say, or some way to make you feel welcome, or some way to generally encapsulate your work. And it just seems like the intersections of disciplinarity in Toronto are fantastic. Not all cities, particularly cold ones, have people who travel from, I lived in Rochester for 12 years. I enjoy having salt on my boots today, but not all cities. I spend a lot of time in LA, and people don't always travel to go to other universities and collaborate together. So it's just been, I've been coming to Toronto since before I got my PhD, and it's just a really, really exciting place for me to visit intellectually. So thank you, Patrick, for bringing me into the information studies context, where I have spent a lot of time for 10 years at UCSD. So I'm just delighted to be able to speak in that context. And Fiora Dalla is here from UCSD as well, and can attest to the intense intersection between information studies and visual studies in that context. And thank you also to Visual Studies and Matt Brower for co-sponsoring the talk here, and to Matt for being a really wonderful intellectual fellow traveler for a very long time, from Rochester to now. So this talk, my hero, a media archaeology of body-mounted camera technologies of the self, came out of fieldwork that I've been doing for 3 years in the state of Kansas on the transformation of the agricultural landscape and agricultural communities into the wind corridor and into the wind industries, the sort of empty core of the U.S. wind tunnel. So what happened is that we began using cameras and theorizing the use of cameras, and the project began in the year that the GoPro was released. And we've been trying to figure out how to use the GoPro in the project, which we haven't begun to do yet. So this is a paper that moves backward from the GoPro to think through the history of cameras and camera technologies. And at this point, I think of cameras as being continuous, film cameras as being continuous from photography to motion picture cameras. I don't make a distinction anymore. So Technoscience studies has a long history of sharing methods developed in adjacent approaches like distributed cognition, human technology, or HCI, human-computer interaction, and STS more broadly. Information studies has been very much in dialogue with those fields. The question of how information travels has been posed on different scales, from very macroscopic studies to studies of the micro levels of intersubjective activity. Yet, at the same time, very little reflexive work has been done to theorize what technoscientific studies gets from media theory and from feminist and critical visual theory with regard to the place of the visual in technoscientific ethnographic research. So the most general aim of my talk, if you feel like you've seen a lot of different things that don't go together and you're wondering where I was going, my general aim is to push forward reflexive questions about the camera as an apparatus of mediation and interaction. I won't be focusing on photographs in themselves, although I'll be showing you photographs as means through which to analyze the technology. I'll be focusing specifically on the condition of the take in using cameras. And that brings me to the matter of the camera, the form of the camera, and that's a matter both for technology studies and for media archaeology. What concerns me is the camera's relationship to embodied experience. That's a matter for phenomenology, and phenomenology of everyday life with new media, film phenomenology. I work in a geographic network in Southern California where I am very much in dialogue with the work of Vivian Sobczak and the work of Erkki Huhtamo in media archaeology, Vivian Sobczak in film phenomenology. And I am very much fellow travelers with Sarah Kimber and Joanna Zielinska, whose Life After New Media is one of my favorite new books, as well as with Lisa Parks, whose work on infrastructures and global infrastructures is, I think, some of the most critically important feminist technoscientific work being done today. So my orientation to the camera is disciplinarily multifaceted, and I'll be posing questions about the relationship of the body of the camera and the body of the camera user as theorized across the domains of critical art practice, STS, the study of media and visual culture in everyday life. The use of the camera in the intersubjective and often empathetic activity of working in the social field with cameras as tools of mediation, observation, and documentation. This is the center of my concerns. So I have a really simple thesis that motivated stepping back from the ethnography about which I've spoken for a couple of years and have a couple of papers coming out as it's evolving. So I'm stepping back to consider how we can have a fruitful dialogue on the one hand with researchers in technoscience studies who use video and photography to analyze and observe interaction, and on the other hand with video art and photography practitioners and historians who've engaged reflexively with the matter of how intersubjectivity is constituted through work with the camera. Artists who've emphasized this relationship occurring not simply in the image or the imaging function of the camera, but through the activity of using cameras to interact and to reflexively interrogate mediation. So images, I hope to suggest, can be used as routes through which to understand the kinds of interaction that happen at the photographic take, which is not a moment, but a situated circumstance that unfolds in a particular configuration of space and time. The image can be a route through which to do an archaeology of the camera. So what concerns me most is the relationship of the camera body to the researcher body, or the artist as researcher. So I'll be looking at people like Valley Export and very briefly Vito Acconci and some of his early work where he was looking at things like proxemics and sort of early information studies people to try and understand interaction when he followed people around with cameras. But also thinking through questions that are very central to feminist and queer technoscience studies, the question of subjectivity that has been so absent from work in science and technology studies, and particularly in the history of science, which has really, really, really gone toward objectivity. So when we study others to determine how information and feeling flow and are exchanged, cameras are increasingly more than a locus of mediation. They're embedded in most of the places many of us inhabit and in most of the devices we handle every day. Put your hand in your pocket and you'll probably find a camera. And so through the camera is negotiated political subjectivity, political affect, and all of its resonant information, feeling, and empathy. And so we need to look more closely at that locus of mediation, the camera, which demands a media archaeology, a kind of digging down into the techno-psychical components of the camera body mechanism, what apparatus theorists of the 1970s called machines of the visible. But I'm moving the needle here from thinking about cameras as instruments of knowledge practices to thinking about being and feeling with cameras, from epistemology of the image and economies of knowledge production and representation to the critical matter of subjectivity in embodied work with cameras. And that has been sorely, I feel, neglected in technoscience studies in favor of projects about objectivity, scientific quest for knowledge, even in those studies that are focused on the micro level of interaction from a phenomenological perspective. And an increasingly critical piece of missing data in the archaeology of the camera is its role in the constitution of empathy, which is, of course, always distributed among technologies and places as well as between bodies and things. Cameras have bodies, they contain feeling. How then do we move from a dissection of their parts to an account of the historical residue of, for example, reverence for life, fascination with death, built into their design, and historically speaking, screwed in place tight with textual tools like the patent? The conquest of the apparatus and life worlds. Okay, so I should back up a second because I saw some looks like, okay, so how do we move from a dissection of parts? The typical move in media archaeology is to say I'm going to open up the black box. And I'm actually not going to open up the black box. I'm going to suggest that the black box is extensive and open already, and that you follow those lines out. And that built into the camera through patents is not just design features, but reverence for life, a fascination with death. The very idea of a black box is in itself a fascination with death that's inbuilt to the psychosocial component of the patent as the thing that seals that box and seals death into that box, or reverence for life, something you can't see, God in the box. So the concept of the apparatus and life world requires some consideration here because I'm referring to them, and you don't want to just sort of put phenomenology out there and assume that everybody knows what phenomenology or what apparatus you mean. So apparatus and life world. When Giorgio Agamben asked in What is an Apparatus, asked what is an apparatus in his essay, What is an Apparatus, he was responding to what he called a decisive technical term in the writings of Foucault on governmentality from the 70s forward. So in asking that question in 2009, he was telling us to look back to 1970s Foucault. And he reminds us that Foucault's apparatus is the network that can be established between And then there's a long list, and you know what it is. Scientific statements, institutions, philosophy, moral and philanthropic propositions. So the apparatus is a formation that has at its as its function a response to an urgent situation. In returning to the apparatus of the 1970s, I want to suggest that as media scholars, we don't forget those other people who wrote on the apparatus in the 1970s, the writings of the Korean, French, Italian, and British film theorists and artists who also worked on the material conditions of the apparatus during that same decade. I'm referring here to the work of Korean-born artist and theorist Teresa Hak-Young-cha, the Italian film theorist Teresa de Lauretis, the French media theorist and artist Thierry Kuncel. The list goes on and on. We know the names. These practitioners wrote and produced media in precise and detailed ways with respect to the matter of the apparatus and the materiality of the world. And as Agamben asks his readers to do in 2009, they asked their readers to do in the 70s, stressing the interactions among the technical and the coextensivity of the biological and the psychical, the bridging levels of scale from the micro level to the macro level. So at the center of observation of most contemporary systems of power, we find the camera and also the projector, which I suggest is inside the camera in the form of the inbuilt viewfinder. And that viewfinder is missing, so that's going to be where we move. The viewfinder is disappearing from the camera. The camera component of cell phones, personal computers, and security technologies is an inbuilt instrumentation of embodiment and intersubjectivity that's changing. For the apparatus theorists of the 70s, to study the camera was to study the shared conditions of fantasy, intersubjective empathy, and the distribution of affect in a given life world as encapsulated inside the box, whether that box be the room of the theater or the box of the camera. The life world, a concept that was introduced by Searle in 1936, is the pre-epistemological ground for the world that subjects may experience together, a kind of collective intersubjective realm of feeling and perceiving. Obviously, he wrote, this is true, not only for me, the individual, rather in living together, we're pre-given in this world together. This we subjectivity, we-subjectivity, is constantly functioning for Husserl in The Crisis of the European Sciences, his text of 1936. Now, Edith Stein, Husserl's first research assistant and author of a major work of phenomenology, a dissertation she defended in 1916 and published in 1917 in Germany, later under the English title of On the Problem of Empathy, Edith Stein is credited by film theorist Adriano de Loya as the first to enucleate the specificity of empathy, developing empathy's distinction from judgment and other concepts. And I think he's right. Adriano de Loya is an Italian film theorist who's working across cognitivism and phenomenology. So a biographical aside about Edith Stein. She has long been the subject of bemusement and criticism and a kind of recent reinterest for her turn amidst the Holocaust from Judaism to Catholicism and her desertion of the academy and philosophy for the convent and its philosophy, a change that failed to spare her from the Nazi camps and death in the Nazi camps. Stein was canonized, her ordainment as a saint standing in stark contrast to the complete lack of credit she received for her work under her mentor, Husserl. An evidence-based hypothesis that has been proposed by some historians of philosophy is that Edith Stein was in fact more than a medium and scribe for specifically his work on time. She may in fact have contributed concretely to this volume on time to the extent that its status as a sole authored volume possibly might be brought into question. And I don't know that that's accurate, but it certainly deserves consideration, considering the degree to which we have a really stunning absence of female philosophers in our citation lists. So Stein felt that the mechanisms of empathy were central unresolved problematics for philosophy. And based on her writings, Adriano de Loya considers empathy in regard to filmic representations of the body. In the discussion of cameras that I will be turning to, I'm not going to consider representations except as routes through which to get back to the camera. So bringing the camera as agent back into the picture. This brings the phenomenology of technology into play, Don Aietti's legacy, and the phenomenology of media through the domain commanded by Vivian Sobczak, moving us off the topic of spectatorship and engagement with the image and onto the terrain of the apparatus and the technoscientific activity that takes place in its worlds. So if there's any doubt about bringing phenomenology, media archaeology, and the ontological matter of the camera into feminist science, technology, and information studies, consider this. Consider the place of the camera in these recent undergraduate program initiatives at Princeton this year. This is the program in Robotics and Intelligent Systems at Princeton. They posted a list online recommending projects for undergraduates to pursue. For students with a computer science focus, the invitation was extended to do a project organized around one of the following tasks. Detect all objects of some type, such as faces in a visual scene. Develop a system combining body-mounted cameras and/or Kinect with tactile or auditory feedback to help blind people avoid obstacles. For electrical engineering students, the invitation in the same program was extended to engage in detection and recognition of hand gestures using video. The goal of this project is to develop algorithms that, taken as video from a camera, you could analyze to identify well-defined patterns of hand activity, and the proposed application is to analyze this data for product design, for example, to mine it for designing computing systems and games. Mechanical and aerospace engineering students are advised to participate in a project in which an uninhabited vehicle is designed, or to work on the design of a camera that flies and could be controlled remotely from the ground, an instrument that could measure data. And it's proposed that such a camera could be marketable to archaeologists around the world. So in each and every one of these proposed projects, camera technologies are sources of information and data, sources of observation, navigation of the world, and intersubjective engagement. In the second example, the body-mounted camera design proposed to serve not as a technology for making photographs, but as a wayfinding device. The imaging function of the camera would be inconsequential. The camera would serve instead as an in an interlocking set of technologies in which data acquired through the lens would be output in the form of voice, not image, to help users who are blind avoid obstacles and stay on track. In the electrical engineering project, a camera is engaged to record hand gestures, and that data about how hands tend to work would become generative of an algorithm for the design of the placement of buttons and levers on a game or an interface. So I'm hoping that you are with me in understanding here that my reason for turning to the specific case of body-oriented or body-mounted cameras that are a major hot item on the consumer market right now, and their particular configurations of intersubjectivity is important not just because it's a popular cultural item, but because it's present in every level of innovation, research, development to the popular. In 2009, and here my paper takes a shift and you see pictures. In 2009, I began a longitudinal visual ethnography. I did my first IRB, and focusing with photographer Stephen Rubin of Penn State University's art department on the rise of wind energy, industrial wind energy development and technological transformation in the American Midwest. And so Stephen Rubin is a photographer who, at the height of his successful career as a photojournalist, working in the humanist tradition of North American social realism in a global context, especially in places of crisis, switched course and began to engage in critical art practice. And it was at that point that our paths crossed and we decided to collaborate. Our agreement when we entered the field in 2009 was to divide the job. He would take pictures, I would take notes. But two things happened. Through the photographs that he took, Stephen began to inject our project with what I felt to be a theory about subjectivity in the human body in the field. A theory expressed in photographs that in fact ran counter to my own ideas about how I wanted to represent the cinematic technology of wind turbines, which of course I wanted to study because they were in and of themselves cinematic machines. So I felt the need to use the camera reflexively to document the mechanism of the technological apparatus of the wind turbine field and the body technology relationships in that field as they unfolded as kind of wind turbines rolled across the state, kind of imprinting themselves upon existing farms and ranches. And I wanted to put the visuals above the words and the features of the human face. So I wanted to push back the words and push back the faces. And Stephen, who holds degrees in critical visual studies and sociology, said very little about his theory, but kept on putting forward the face. And so we clashed on this. And so our project proceeded. And this was right at the beginning of the project. Stephen was in Kansas and drove out to Wyoming to capture some activity around trucking where the roads hadn't been adapted well enough to support the heavy load that was being carried. And I think we'll need to have dark for this. This trucker had taken a wrong turn, and the nacelle he was carrying, the 40-ton nacelle he was carrying, fell off the truck and sort of embedded itself into the road like a meteorite. And Stephen rushed out to document it. So our major concern in this project, and he kind of like did this for me because I was the one who said I wanted to document infrastructure, and I wanted to document how the roads did not, the supporting of the roads, the rebuilding of the roads did not yet support the demands of interstate trucking of heavy parts. And a major concern of ours is how do you document wind, an invisible substance, and in Kansas, sky is everything. So we wanted as well to capture a new workforce of tech workers who were being trained for performing their jobs in what was being promoted as the new office in the sky, with the idea that tech workers would need to climb to the nacelle. That thing that fell into the ground is the part that is at the very top of the turbine that holds the blades. And the new office in the sky is the computer apparatus that is up there in the nacelle. And so with mountain climbing gear and computer repair technology, workers have been trained both to be climbers and to be high-tech computer repair people. Okay, and we wanted to look at wind, but found that it was impossible not to look at the development of the electrical grid, both on the site of each wind facility and extending out into other communities that were not being slated for wind development, but through which the wires had to pass in order to transport the power. So Stephen always seemed to find evidence of the industry's smallness, its engagement with technologies that are straightforward, and its relationships to technology that are basic and grounded. We have some images like this that show monumentality and the sort of lofty experience of work in the sky, but we have mostly images like this that show the groundedness of work around wind. You would think of wind as being an industry that's about doing something that is transcendent and in the sky or in the wires, but most of the work takes place very much on and in fact also under the ground. And these are some guys training at Cloud County Community College in Kansas so that they can be the new high-tech office workers in the sky who also need to know how to climb, and they're being trained by mountain climbing experts. Simulation of working up by the blades, practicing down on the ground. This is a worker in wind, a former wheat farmer and still a landowner who is now a real estate developer for wind, and that's his trike. And so Stephen was very good at always bringing things down to scale. We showed up for an appointment and we were too late, and the staff was gone in this particular wind company, but the worker is cleaning, and you can see the scale model of the turbine in the corner. So at night, as I entered my field notes on my computer, Stephen downloaded raw files, hundreds, then thousands of files, filled drive after drive on each research trip. And after some time, I became aware that his resistance to my requests to document more came from not only his respectful reticence to intervene in the activities of workers and the lives of people, which, after all, we had signed on our IRB that we would not disturb, but also his reluctance had to do with not wanting to generate unmanageable quantities of very large raw data files. The power dynamics of divvying up image production and writing was brought home to me one day during a cattle roundup in Beaumont, Texas, a central Texas tallgrass prairie ranch. So I'm going to spend some time talking about not a camera so much as a camera in the context of cattle roundup. Rancher Pete Farrell owns a considerable parcel of land in the temperate Kansas prairie, land that is leased out as a summer feeding ground for cattle owners, for cattle owned and raised by ranchers whose land lies in drier territories. Pete also leases out his land to wind developers. And so his ranch doubles as the site of the Elk River Wind Farm. Cattle shipped to Pete's fertile grassland to fatten up amidst wind turbines that crop up randomly like Silver Branch on the otherwise treeless plain, pass through the state. They're temporary workers there. And this is Pete and the owner of the cattle that we rounded up on that day while they're waiting for the cattle to be loaded on the trucks. And Pete is the rancher on your right, and the man on the left is the Texas rancher who owns the cattle. Now, roundup involved an assemblage of ranch hands on horseback. Had my slides a little out of order here. Suited up in chaps to jockey the cattle spread out over many acres into narrow pens from which they would be funneled into cattle trucks and shipped back to Texas. But it also entailed the use of a truck in place of the iconic horse to get the cattle into line. Rancher Pete invited me to ride along with him in the cab of his pickup truck so that I could conduct an interview while he drove, because he was a busy guy. So as I hopped into the cab, iPad in hand, to take my notes, Stephen, laden with camera gear, climbed onto the open flatbed of the truck to document the kind of automotive-generated stampede to the pens that we were about to spur. Two things became clear. The horseback activity was partly a show for the purpose of visiting ethnographers, a performance in which signifiers of Old West and horsemanship were played up for our benefit. The truck would be doing most of the heavy lifting. The intention was not to fool us, but to provide a display of classical ranch technique of which the group of ranch hands assembled was rightfully proud. Second, this relationship was implementing an intersubjective logic of the gaze that would result in a particular sort of power relationship between Stephen's camera and my writing iPad. Stephen, weighted down to the flatbed with multiple lenses and heavy equipment, had no choice but to sit facing the rear, his back pressed against the cab of the pickup in order to keep himself from being thrown. I, with my lightweight iPad, was facing forward at the helm with Rancher Pete as he drove the herd to its point of entrapment. It soon became clear that Pete would be driving the truck not on the dirt road, but in a circuitous path to round up the cattle through the undulating terrain of high grass, weaving around the turbines in the field. As the truck circled in repetitive series of nauseating loops, Pete honked his horn wildly to get the cattle's attention and excite them, opening up the floodgates of story at the same time, launching into his account of his decisions to lease his land to wind developers, despite intense community pressure to keep the tall grass prairie clear of the industrial blight of the turbine. I put my head down and wrote, avoiding the cinematic riot of cattle faces, panicky cow eyes coursing by my window frame like bodies swept up inside the curl of a wave. And to be clear, I have no images of this, and you'll understand in a minute why. My eyes were cast down by necessity, that's how I write, but because it made me ill to look up at the shaky tracking shot that was being so artfully produced not by Stephen but by Pete, who drove the scene with one hand on the steering wheel, the other in the air, inflecting his story, which was driving my account with passionate feeling about why wind development should occur on the tall grass prairie. Spinning turbines out the window, a spiraling truck containing me and my subject in one configuration, and there was my partner in ethnography in another. The camera on which we relied for controlled documentation was now shooting backward. Its lens pointed away from the action of the cattle. We pushed forward like specks of dirt before a broom. The camera and its take were not so much out of Stephen's control as they were driven by the turbine action of the truck, driven by Pete, who was calling the shots, his truck a virtual dolly gone awry. Now, a lot of field notes got recorded in that riotous hour. Stephen, however, struggled mightily to hang on to the camera and to get in a look through the viewfinder before he took shots. The images he did take documented more than anything the disadvantage to which his expert gaze had been put by Pete's driving of the truck as dolly. The shots failed to catch the looks of the bodies in the herd, failed to catch the momentum of their panicked forward rush that was so apparent to me any moment I ventured a peek through the window. Hundreds of images, all rich with raw data, none of them showing anything of value, except indirectly the disorientation of the gaze of the camera operator on the occasion of being randomly taken for a ride on the cinematic apparatus of the roundup. I've been giving talks for 2 years now based on the progression of field work from this project, and each time I struggle with this particular condition of the control of the camera. As compelling as the turbines are with their cinematic gyrations and their transformative appropriation of the historic grain belt, now rebranded the wind belt, I found myself returning to a mental diagram, a conceptual map of our very different optical experiences, mine in the cab of the truck and Stephen's with the camera looking backward. In the moment of the roundup, if analysis of the photographic apparatus must include the conditions of its operation in its specific social context, what apparatus theorist Teresa Ha-Kyung Cha and Stephen Heath identified as the space of the theater, then this was also a photographic space and a cinematically mobilized space of photography. The turbine was in itself an optical instrument, a camera and projector rolled into one, but the entire scene had been rendered cinematic. Okay, and this is Pete sitting in a shelter waiting for the cattle to be loaded, and our ranch hands herding. And then here we have the interior of some of those turbines. So the turbine as an optical instrument, a camera and projector rolled into one, with its internal sort of classical materials of the black box open for view here. But at the same time, the opening of the black box doesn't tell us the dynamic of this particular social scene, which is the larger field in which the turbines perform their turbulent transformations, the scenes of the everyday. And so part of what we're documenting is the impact of the turbines cinematically, the flicker, the sound, the impact on communities. And we're asking the question, where is the operator of this instrument of audiovisual perception? And I've suggested already that Stephen was not the operator of our camera on that day, but that Pete was, and it was not that Pete was intentionally or willingly the operator, but that operation is a distributed activity. So to return to that idea of the camera operator, Stephen in the back of the pickup had been operating without the benefit of access to his viewfinder. And the remainder of my talk is going to focus, weaving in and out, on the idea of the viewfinder, not just the camera, but the part within the camera that is the viewfinder that not all cameras have. His images were chaotic in their angles and framing, and they were an artifact of the mobile technology of the pickup. So as Stephen and I moved forward in our research, we began to consider two aspects of the apparatus more closely. The viewfinder and its relationship to intentionality, and intentionality is a key point of focus for the phenomenological theory of Edith Stein. And Stephen tried for mobility and avisuality. The second point is that Stephen began to try to capture mobility and avisuality in the field of the image. So we began to think more about how we could utilize what had happened on the back of the truck by aiming for a way of controlling the camera to capture these instances of the cinematic that could be caught in the still photograph. And this is some men who are working on a wind site, running for cover as the weather changes. A lot of times we'd show up to an installation and it would be too windy or it would rain. And so we'd really witness the failure of the project to proceed on that day. Or getting the camera down at the level of the ground and getting perspectives on the turbines that would not be ones that would be ordinarily seen. Okay, so this involved moving the camera in different ways for Stephen, keeping the camera in a different comportment in relationship to his body. And so I began to look back at the way that people hold cameras, and of course it was hard not to look at the use of the brownie. And this image, you may have seen it this year because it's an Edwardian woman in 1900 with a brownie box camera, and this image was scanned from a 4x5 glass negative, and it has been reproduced in a number of articles this year in the popular press. I reproduced it from Alison Chantel, who wrote an article with the headline, "This photo from 1900 might be the oldest selfie ever taken." It's from Business Insider. So what interests me here is not just that it's being identified as the oldest selfie, and of course we know there's an older selfie, I'll talk about that in a minute. That concerns me less than the fact that it's at her hips. That the camera is down at the level of her hips. And she's looking not into the camera, and into the box, but she's looking into the mirror that is in the space of the field of her gaze that is the field of the room. And so if we begin to think about the distribution of the gaze and the fragmentation of subjectivity through which contemporary viewfinderless cameras put us, I think it's important to look back to notice that this is not something that is being instituted in a kind of digital era, but that there are many, many instances that are pre-video, and in fact also pre-photographic. Oh, this one's hilarious. Possibly the first selfie taken by a teenager and sent to friends in 1914. The earliest selfie is identified as having been taken in 1839 by a Philadelphia chemist named Robert Cornelius, and this particular one is being used in the press this year to suggest this might be the earliest teen selfie, to kind of give a historical arc to this genre. But those articles are missing some other selfies. Portrait of a young woman drawing, Marie Denis Villers, 1774 to 1821 is her lifespan, and it was painted in 1801, and for some time it was attributed to David. It hangs in the Met. And it's understood to be a self-portrait, and I love this one. Artemisia Gentileschi's 1638-39 oil on canvas. It's a self-portrait. And I want you to imprint in your memory the foreshortening of her body, because it's really, really reminiscent of the it prefigures the foreshortening that we find in the GoPro, which I'll be talking about in 5 minutes. Okay, so the brownie, introduced in 1900. Most brownies had viewfinders with a reflex mirror assembly inside. Simply put, the camera had a window in front, a window at the top, and an angled mirror inside that connected the two windows. In order to compose the picture, you had to hold the camera down at about waist level and look down into the finder. Once the subject was composed in the approximate center of the viewfinder, the shutter lever could then be depressed, and there were no framing marks in the viewfinder. It was introduced with a slogan, operated by any schoolgirl or boy. And the term snapshot, which Matt Brower gives some attention to in his work on hunting and animals and cameras, the term of the snapshot has to do with shooting from the hip without aim, used in photography in the 1860s, but really which became a reality with the Brownie, which was this kind of amateur camera without a viewfinder that could be utilized at the level of the head. Okay, $1. And I love this little collapsible Brownie, and I have no reason to show it other than it's amazing, 1907. I love the red accordion. So the single lens reflex camera, which has been around for over a century, has a mirror inside that flips up when you take the picture, and goes black at the very instant of the take, the instant at which the image is recorded. So single lens reflex cameras are the most popular, or have been. There's some changes afoot, but what I want to emphasize here is the temporality of the single lens reflex camera, that when you look into the viewfinder and you have the experience of seeing the shot that you will take, the mirror must move so that the shot can happen. And so there's a displacement of the temporality of the shot and the temporality of the look. This is a rangefinder camera from 1947, and the 50s were kind of the decade of the rangefinder, which allowed, this particular one allowed the photographer to measure the subject distance. And because there's no mirror inside that flips, like there is in the SLR, the lenses can be designed without having to keep the back of the lens far enough away from the image plane to avoid getting hit by the mirror. And most popular, these were the most popular small cameras of the 50s. And so I want to ask why. Was this the quantitative era in which computational logic dominated or came forward in the culture? That's just speculation. So this is just kind of an aside on sort of amateur cameras and a preface to introducing the concern in the consumer world right now, in which people are asking things like, where is the viewfinder on this camera? And is there such a thing, is there such a word as viewfinderlessness? The quote in the media, every mirrorless camera always puts lack of viewfinder under the cons column, and yet we continually get these viewfinderless cameras. So I'm considering here, as a preface to the viewfinderless GoPro, the condition of viewfinderlessness as a historic one and as a very, very significant one that is not about preventing a particular way of looking, but is about constituting an intersubjective way of looking that displaces the gaze not just into the body of the camera, but into an intersubjective space that distributes power in the way that we saw it distributed in the circuitous ride driven unintentionally by the camera operator, Pete, the truck driver. Okay, so knowing how to parse the difference between what you see by eye and what you get through the lens is a key mark of professional heroism. There's a story online about a man who shows up at a place where photography is restricted only to professionals. And he shows up with a viewfinderless camera and he's told, go away, you're not a professional. If you had a viewfinder, you would be a professional. It's only amateurs that use viewfinderless cameras. Stephen's photographs, apart from those from the roundup, work with my written account because they are intentional and they help me to tell a particular sort of story about intersubjectivity and empathy with technology, one stage through the intentionality that is inherent in the framing of the shot. And intentionality has been a nasty word in film and media studies for a long time, but it's a very, very important one to phenomenological discussions of empathy. We begin to contemplate the idea of strapping the new viewfinderless cameras that hit the market in the mid-2000s to the bodies of our research subjects a couple of years ago. And we thought that this would allow us to see kind of the interstices of human interaction with technology. Oh, sorry, viewfinderless cameras. A mirrorless camera introduced in 2012, and a mirrorless camera that is built as a replica of a 1973 to 1979 model of the Olympus. So there's this harking back to an era of viewfinderlessness that is occurring in this move forward to the lightweight, portable, viewfinderless camera that's strapped not to our eyes but to our hands or our feet. Okay, so when Rosalind Krauss wrote video, The Aesthetics of Narcissism, she criticized video for having narcissism as its kind of central motivating component. Narcissism was an aesthetic, a structural characteristic of the medium. What would it mean to say, she asked, that the medium of video is itself narcissism? And I want to suggest that the kind of mirroring that she saw in video, in those articles, is in fact a central component of pre-video film cameras through the viewfinder phenomenon. And that mirroring has never been direct, immediate, and narcissistic, but has always been a function of displacement, fragmentation, extensiveness, intersubjectivity, making the camera an unstable site of identity. And this was, in fact, imported to video. And so I think in some ways she got, the critique may have been backward. Okay, so the GoPro camera, My Hero 3. Though not the first of the viewfinder-less cameras adopted for body mounting, the GoPro is perhaps the most ubiquitously successful one on the consumer market. It's the brownie of the contemporary action camera scene. It was developed by Nick Woodman, now a 37-year-old California surfer and a former a graduate of UCSD's art department who entered the school as a computer science major. Woodman's interest came in his success came in 2012 when the GoPro company sold 2.3 million cameras in the Hero line. Foxconn then purchased 8.8% of the company for $200 million US dollars at the end of that year, nailing down the success of the company and bringing its market value to 2.25 billion US dollars. Securing the means for rapid innovation and market share growth. So Nick Woodman is a very, 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 very wealthy man. The seeing hand. To understand the GoPro's apparatus, we have to look at Woodman's hand, to dig up his hand as a design artifact of its technology. Legend has it that the GoPro is a product of DIY culture. Woodman raised money to develop it with his girlfriend, making necklaces by hand, selling them out of his VW van on California byways. Frequented by surfers. A surfer himself, he embarked on a tour of beaches in Indonesia and Australia after a failed business venture. And in one of those remote locations, he strapped a 35mm camera to his hand while surfing in a waterproof encasement, and attempted to take action photos from inside the curl of the wave. So an artifactual but nonetheless momentous shift occurred with this experiment. The lens of the camera was displaced from the position of the photographer's eye, where it would, according to convention, be held by the hand of the photographer, down to the level not of the waist like the brownie, but of the hand, to which the camera was literally bound. Tasked with the work of balance and staying aloft on the surfboard, the hand, and with it the camera, followed a dramatic circuitous path. The movement suggested in each shot or in the continuous video would have been rendered as an artifact of the movement of the surfer as he used his appendages to keep himself upright and balanced, and not as a result of his measured and calculated framing activity, what he would have seen with his eye. Okay, that was not happening. So the viewfinder, which he would later remove from the camera, was useless. His camera had a viewfinder, but it was useless. And much like a pencil or a brush, the camera became by default an instrument for rendering a scene by hand, and for rendering that scene quite literally in strokes. The stroke of swimming, the stroke of making a brush mark, the action of making the mark and the mark that's left behind. Whereas viewfinder cameras exercise the eye, Woodman's camera exercised the hand as the driver of the composition. The camera traced a pattern, not quite arbitrary, but firmly unmotivated by seeing or even representation of the look. What is documented instead are the phenomenological conditions of immersion into the world of, in this case, water and the space of the wave. Okay, so this is a GoPro camera affixed to the head of a runner, a GoPro affixed to the body of an airplane, bolted in, a camera bolted to the head of Wafa Bilal, performance artist, a self-documenting camera affixed to a performer who was directed by Javier Cha. Vito Acconci using a camera for his Blink project, holding a camera aimed away from me and ready to shoot while walking down a continuous line down a street. Try not to blink. Every time I blink, I snap. And for Acconci, art is a place of meeting. You know these pieces were really about a life together. This is not about narcissism. And here he is following somebody with his camera. Valley export, adjunct dislocations, camera front, camera back, pointed to document what comes before her, what comes behind. And notice the straps. Notice the straps. This is the marketing extras that you can buy with the GoPro, a multitude of straps, the chesty, the strap for your head, straps for your hand. And then belatedly in 2012, 3 years after the introduction of the camera, an app that is a viewfinder app. However, critically, the app is a writing pad. The app is your phone. The app is your iPod, your iPad, your screen. The app is not attached to the camera. So the viewfinder has been separated. It's a separate instrument from the camera. And then some GoPro surfing footage by people who use Nick Woodman's camera to give you a sense of the emphasis on immersion and how this camera is really designed to document immersion. This is by a surfer. Her name is Dre, and she keeps a blog of her photographs. I'm sneaking in Kathy Opie's photographs of surfers, sorry. Just a second there. I'll put it up a little longer. Okay, Kathy Opie surfing photos pre-GoPro. Dre, how does she get documented? The camera's on the tip of her surfboard. What are the bubbles in front of her face? The water that splashes on the lens of the camera. So these are self-documentation that's random. Camera on the surfboard. Camera on the surfboard. And then the random take of the hand that gives you a sense of the foreshortening that the GoPro performs that I'm so interested in relationship between things, images like this and the Gentileschi painting that I showed you earlier. And then we have Lucien Castaigne-Taylor's work with 35 small cameras to shoot Leviathan. His work with Verena Paravel in 2012. A dozen cameras, 35 millimeter in DCP. And reviews say things like, tossed and tethered, passed from fisherman to filmmaker. It's a cosmic portrait of one of mankind's oldest endeavors, describing their work in Leviathan, which tracks the work of the camera, not only above the water, but below the water on a fishing trawler. And this is another piece made from the footage. It's titled, He Maketh a Path to Shine After Him. One would think the deep to be hoary, using multiple cameras. This was an installation at the Berlin Film Festival. And I'm sorry, this is a shot from the Berlin Film Festival last year where there was a gallery-like scenario for showing this immersive work with instrument-held and handheld cameras, so attaching the cameras to things like oars, for example. And the New York Times on Leviathan, A.O. Scott says, it offers not information but immersion. So it's this quality of viewfinderlessness and immersion that I'm trying to struggle through and address. And it brings me back to some of the earliest work that I've done on ultrasound and scanners. This is a water bath scanner made out of a B-29 gun turret. And here is a researcher inside his apparatus. So what do we find when we open the black box? The black box of ultrasound, when we open it, we find researchers themselves situated inside that box. And surprise, what's inside the mirror? The reflective mirrors of the viewfinder camera. The image next to it is one of the images that was produced in this early 1957 scanner. He's got a lead weight on his lap to keep him fully immersed while the instrumentation follows the edge of the gun trowel. They used horse troughs, they used gun turrets for these, and this is Gerald Posiconi in an early ultrasound apparatus reproduced in Life magazine. And then a handheld articulated arm scanner introduced in '61. That was a '68 version. So it's the mechanical hand. Okay. I'm going to leave off there. I was going to show Christina Lammer's work, Hand Movie, and Teresa Chaw's work on in Mouth to Mouth. But I think we're sort of over time here. So I'll end here with the point of viewfinderlessness, which is a term used by consumers to describe and decry the trend toward cameras marked explicitly for use with the activity of finding the object of one's shot with one's own eyes prior to the take. But viewfinderlessness has a long history, not only in technologies, but in media produced by artists engaging questions of intersubjectivity, as one could show through a more extended discussion of Lammer's work, Valley Export's work, Vito Acconci's work. The figure of the hero with which the GoPro branding plays in its product line name is tacitly understood to be myself. By using my GoPro, I can go pro as a surfer. I can create footage of myself that will render my performance visible. But as in the case of Stephen and Pete's truck, the camera field has expanded. One would have thought that an archaeology of its technology would have taken me inside the GoPro, inside its interior mechanisms, but instead those mechanisms have become extensive and they exist coextensively in the world. The viewfinderless body-mounted camera is an apparatus that asks us to unman it, even as it holds out the offer to be a hero. The offer to be a hero is, of course, the offer to be a camera through a fragmented, coextensive relationship of immersion in its life world. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.
I want to just ask you about two things because it came up to me that might add to your archive. I was thinking, on the one hand, of Donna Haraway's work around credit cam. In that species meter, she talks about the attachment of cameras to animals as a way of increasing interspecies empathy.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, so that's a kind of feminine thing. And then about asking you, how do you think about this move to the broader situation of the camera and whether you make any distinctions or how you see it in relation to Ariella Azoulay's work around the photographic situation in which she's trying to move to the broader field of the camera, but wanting to situate it in the context of political citizenship.
Yeah, okay, so Donna Haraway and Ariella Azoulay. So in relationship to Donna Haraway's work, the subjectivity of animals is complicated in relationship to cameras. I have a lot of cameras, just talking to Aubrey Annable about this. I have a lot of cameras at home that are consumer cameras that are meant to document animals, and some are given as a joke to put on my dog. Some are meant for me to confirm the presence of skunks in my yard so I can know where they live and either better feed them or have somebody remove them. And as I worry about the skunks, I take away the dog's water, and then I fear that they'll be thirsty. So, but I want to document, I want to know where they are, whether I have a relationship of care to the skunk or whether I want to kill it. I want to know where it is. So what that has to do with the animal's subjectivity is complicated, and it's not the same thing as the kind of relationship that Donna Haraway talks about in relationship to animals in her work on interspecial relationships. The camera introduces something different. And so I would be hesitant to look at that in this paradigm because I'm trying to think about intentionality. And I'm not sure what my dog or my skunk, where they would meet me in that scene. Yeah. And political citizenship. Yeah, so I struggle because Stephen and I are working on something that is micro level. You know, we're doing these communities, but we're also trying to track the movement of things. So we do a lot of work with like truckers who take Chinese parts from the port in Portland to the Kansas wind farm, Mexican cooks who moved to small towns to accommodate the workers and their needs for food. So we're doing some of that, but we're not saying, let us look at this political economy or the issue of citizenship. We're trying to articulate its enactment on the ground and trying to show it through things like following the Chinese turbine, that kind of issue. So there's different process involved.
The images that you and Stephen did,
Yes.
are the ones without the humans in them,
Yes.
are just gorgeous.
There's. I don't think I had any of mine in here. Those are all Stephen's.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. Did you shoot as well? Because it seemed like there was the eagle ray of attention, which Stephen was holding, and you were doing another form of intention. Did you take turns? Like, did you shoot while he recorded? And if not, you did.
Yeah, sometimes
Okay.
sometimes we went together and would spend weeks there together, and then we would both go out with cameras, and he chose to adopt the codes of black and white, and my images are all in color, and mine are really, really colorful and really large and very graphic, and I didn't show any of them here. And doing something else with my images. So my way of satisfying, well, Stephen's not doing what I want to do with the images, it was very easy to say, I will just make these images. Yeah, and the GoPro is kind of coming out of my research interest, but I'm very, very reticent to use it because it's already being used recreationally in what I would want to do for research work, and so I have to figure out what that means.
I'm still trying to puzzle out some of the kind of analytic stakes of the talk.
Okay.
So my question is kind of an analytic question. So I'm trying to kind of put together the commitment to thinking of extension
Yeah.
and the question of immersion.
Uh-huh.
Because one could connect the dots in a simple way and say immersion is kind of an extension or the flip side of a similar thing that you're trying to describe.
Yeah.
Where immersion is kind of like the affective position of being an extension.
It's fluid.
Or the
Yeah, there's the
affective- or some
fluidity
kind
of
capture,
connectivity of
immersion,
fluid.
Some kind of capture of being
Yeah,
an
getting an
extension.
electric shock.
But
in
at
water.
the same time, when I look at those images
Uh-huh.
that capture immersion, they really don't speak extension to me.
Uh-huh.
And so you talked about foreshortening
Yeah.
happening inside of those kind of examples of immersion.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering if you could kind of tease apart the way those put them together. What are these two analytics doing together?
Yeah.
And then there seems to be something really different about their states
About extension
versus
and
immersion.
connectivity and immersion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't do a lot of work with kind of analyzing the GoPro images, in part because there wasn't time to get to that, and I don't want to put too much stakes, too many investments in what I say the images do. And it's very difficult because I'm struggling with what those images do, and they do different things. And I think that the GoPro is pretty new. There isn't a whole lot of range to what is out there yet, except things that people throw up on the web. And so, yeah, I could say, well, those images don't show connectivity or something. For whom? For those surfers, they may really, really be a fundamental bonding experience. And so I don't really know that unless I study how the surfers use the camera, which I'm not going to do because I don't study the surfers, I study the wind people, and they don't use these cameras. But I do want to know how, my question has to do with how can I use this camera to analyze intersubjectivity in a field that is not water, that is wind, that is wheat, that is flat, that has turbines, in a way that isn't about, look how monumental these instruments are, look how classically vast the fields of grain are. So I'm struggling to find an aesthetic more than I am trying to figure out what are surfers doing with it now. I don't think cameras are all that locked into a pictorial way of doing things. You can do a lot of things with cameras, and that's why I'm more concerned not with the aesthetic of what the photographs do, as this, the design. There is no viewfinder, and when I go out, I go crazy. There's no viewfinder, and then I get excited that there's no viewfinder. And that's a really different thing from saying what my pictures do, because they all look terrible and stupid so far. You know, they're useless. As Aubrey was saying, you look at them once, and they're like, wow, that's interesting. Nobody wants to see them. Or sometimes they're really interesting, but that's just because they're odd. And it's very hard to know what to do with the images, but the technology itself has an immersiveness that has to do with what happens when your image taking is separate from what you see. Does that somehow address what you're asking?
No,
Okay.
but that's okay.
I'm trying to take the weight off of interpretation of images,
Yeah.
because we'll go all over the place with saying, I feel this from this image.
Right, well, I'm less worried about that and more
Uh-huh.
interested in the extension and immersion as
Okay.
two different ways of figuring relation.
Yes, okay. So when I jokingly said, yeah, water is different, it's fluid, think of getting an electric shock. It's one thing if you're swimming with somebody and you feel connected to them and you use an image to reach out to them. It's another thing if you both get electrocuted in the water and then you know that the water has conveyed something to you and to somebody else. And so it's highly a relational place, and fluidity and immersion doesn't suggest anything more about connectivity than being in air, being in space and not being in water. But so you have to address the specifics, and when those guys go up in the turbines and it's really windy, that's different from when they go up in the turbines and it's not windy. So how to render the specific conditions as opposed to how to say that let's look at media that are in and of themselves immersive is more what I'm trying to do here. Does that get at your?
Yes.
Okay, terrific.
I have a question about the viewfinderlessness.
Yeah.
Because I find that with the GoPro, if you hold it near your face in the same direction you're looking, it just captures all your field of vision.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a camera with a viewfinder and a lens that is slightly more telephoto than what you're
So frustrating. Yeah.
I feel that it would be actually more disjuncting than the
Yes.
GoPro, because the GoPro just captures everything you see. Whereas
Yeah.
this will capture a part so specific that movements are totally different.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you could speak of that.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because so the more you use the GoPro, the more you recognize its conventions and learn to work within them and develop a syntax and a vocabulary and a way of using it with others, so that you begin to know things like, wow, this captures more my feeling of what I see, and I know it will capture that if I hold it up this way. But you wouldn't know that except for the temporal discontinuity of taking it without knowing, going back and looking at it, and then going and taking some more, being confident that it's going to capture what you think it's going to capture. And then you have that semiotic thing of the surprise that like McGree really loves to do. You think it's going to capture just what you see, and you love that, but then when you go and you download it, you know there's going to be something else there that you didn't see. And so there's that pleasure that has to do with the two mysteries that are there. Yeah, so I agree entirely, but I think it has to do with repetition of use. And I think that this is what surfers and people who climb and people who fly and use these find, that they're building up a language amongst themselves. And it's almost like an affective language amongst themselves.
You're right. I didn't
Yeah.
use it. I use it a lot, so I take
What do you use it for?
I'm writing my thesis on the GoPro, so I use it
Oh, fantastic.
a lot to do some research.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's someone else here who's using a GoPro for field work who you probably want to meet and talk to. Introduce you later.
I actually just had, I guess maybe a thought more than a question. I found it really interesting, your conversation about you and the camera operator, I believe Stephen, being in two different positions and not being able to sort of see or document the same things. And it seems to me that with the GoPro, talking to some of my students who use them, I don't have one, but many of my students use them for, climbing and surfing.
Yeah.
That often the person is themselves the Stephen and the Lisa, if you will, because as they're climbing or a lot of the activities they're doing, they have to pay so much attention to the next rock, to where they place the next foot, that they don't actually get to see the vista of climbing up as they're climbing, because their attention is so targeted
Exactly.
on what
Yeah.
they're doing,
Yeah.
that in that time they are the two people. Like
Yeah.
they're looking forward and not seeing it, and then they're looking back, and it's almost like that splitting up happens even with the sort of ideal target user of the GoPro.
That's really interesting. That's a great analysis of what I think what happens. And so then what would you do with multiple cameras? Because that's the sort of ideal, is to own 4, and you've got one at the end of each appendage. So, yeah. So it's not even just like Janus-faced, it's distributed, yeah.
So whenever I see someone with a GoPro camera mounted on their heads, I'm always reminded of this kind of famous illustration from Vannevar Bush's 1945 article about the
great.
Memex.
Uh-huh.
And there's what essentially looks like a GoPro mounted on a man's head as he's sort of manipulating the various kind of hypertextual system, which is seen as this kind of imagining what the personal computer would be like.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, human-computer interaction. There seems to be some really, I think, important links there between how sort of developments in human-computer interaction were being imagined during that period. I mean, Bush was talking about the Memex as an extension of memory, right, and as a form of kind of more empathic computing. He was concerned about computing in the military-industrial complex and wanting to imagine a more sort of a different progress, So I'm wondering if you could say more about if you're thinking about sort of the history of human-computer interaction in relation to this, or if that's...
Yeah, so as I'm working on this, I struggle with whether I should move in 2 particular directions, and one is, should I be looking at the HCI paradigm when I've already got so many other discourses going, and I don't know it as well. It's just not my area of research, and I would be picking and choosing. Really interested in Elizabeth Wilson's work on affect and the early history of computing that tells a different story in terms of interaction. But how this particular technology taps into that technology, I realize that's a very, very important kind of historical thread to follow. But it's not one that I'm prepared to follow because I just know more about cameras than I do about computer interaction and that history. So I couldn't do it. You have to kind of stay within like approximate realms of something you know.
Fair enough.
You know.
It might just be a good illustration to throw up there with your other illustrations of
Yeah.
mounted body mount.
Yeah, it's like when I see Vito Acconci doing this and I see the GoPro, I know that there is a connection there that is very, very clearly through that kind of video camera that he, first the regular camera he was using and then later the video, and I can see all the different relationships to the technology, but I don't have that affinity to the computer that I could, or that knowledge of the history of the computer. So somebody like Liz Losh would know that stuff and be able to tell that story, but I just can't responsibly do that. I can do it with video art, I can do it with history of photography a bit, history of cinema certainly, but not with history of computing.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.